Every neighborhood has its stories, but some are best left untold. In our seemingly serene corner of the world, silence was a gift, cherished and undisturbed. That is, until the night I heard it, the faint ringing of my home phone at the stroke of midnight. It was unusual because, like many, I had grown accustomed to the digital trills of a cell phone, not the shrill cry of a landline seldom used. The sound sliced through the stillness of my room, a room which now seemed too large, the shadows too deep. I hesitated but eventually reached out, the cool plastic of the receiver feeling alien against my ear. But there was nothing. No voice, no static, just an oppressive silence that seemed to echo, not in my ears, but in the hollows of my chest. I might have dismissed it as a fluke, a trick of solitude and silence. But when the morning came, whispers traveled through the neighborhood like ripples on a pond. I wasn't the only one. Each of us received a call, and each of us met with the same unsettling quiet on the other end. We shared our experiences with furrowed brows over cups of coffee and half-hearted chuckles, trying to mask our unease with humor. Yet we all felt it, that tingling prickle at the back of our necks, the unspoken acknowledgement that this was more than a mere coincidence. In the days that followed, the calls became our uninvited midnight guests. No matter the steps we took, unplugging the phones, even disconnecting the service, the ring always found a way through. It became a pattern, a ritual we were unwittingly a part of. With each silent call, I could feel the edges of my reality fraying, giving way to an anxiety I couldn't quite name. The pursuit of an explanation became our shared obsession. We scoured phone records, grilled the service providers, and even entertained the wild theories that floated up from the depths of online forums. But answers were as elusive as the silence on the line. It was in this frenzy of investigation and paranoia that we found the common thread, a number, long out of service, tied to a place we all knew but never spoke of, the abandoned house at the end of the street, with a phone line that had been dead for years. The house loomed over us, a relic of another time, its windows like blind eyes turned inward. It was as if the structure itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to break the stillness. And as the calls persisted, it became clear that whatever was reaching out to us was rooted in the decay of that forgotten place. I remember the sharp breath I drew as the silence from the other end of the line seemed to creep through the earpiece, settling in the room like a thick fog. With each midnight call, the atmosphere thickened, my pulse quickened, and the silence grew heavier. It was as if the very air in my home grew stale, charged with anticipation. These silent calls became the dark clouds hanging over our once sunny neighborhood. Conversations were no longer about day-to-day trivialities but hushed exchanges of personal encounters with this eerie phenomenon. Each of us, bound by this shared dread, wondered silently who would be next. It was during one of these calls that I noticed it, a faint scratching noise as if someone was trying to communicate from the other end. The pattern was irregular and random, yet it sent shivers down my spine. It was the sound of desperation, a cry for help, or perhaps a warning. The decision to investigate was mutual, unspoken. We gathered as a community, each carrying the weight of countless sleepless nights, our faces etched with the same unsettling thought: what if the calls were coming from someone, or something, that once belonged here? The full moon was a spotlight on our procession to the abandoned house at the edge of our neighborhood. The old structure loomed against the night sky, its silhouette a gaping mouth, and the windows like hollow eyes. As we approached, I felt the ground beneath me grow colder, my footsteps heavier, as if the house itself was drawing us in. We knew the phone line had been dead for years, yet as we stepped inside, the ringing started. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder, more insistent. The very walls seemed to hum with it, a symphony of ghosts reaching out from the past. In the heart of the house, we found the source, an old rotary phone, coated in dust, its cord severed. Yet it rang and rang, a sound that shouldn't have been possible. As I reached out, compelled by a force I couldn't understand, the room fell silent. The line was dead, yet the silence now had a voice, and it was only just beginning to speak. The chill that followed was not from the draft or the broken windows, but from the realization that we were not alone. Each shadow seemed to shift, and the air grew tight, suffocating. It was a silence that screamed, and the message was clear: we were intruders, and we were not welcome. In this oppressive silence, the soft creak of a floorboard from the upper level snagged my attention, a discordant note in the eerie stillness of the house. We all froze, a collective breath held, our gazes locked on the ceiling as if we could peer through the old plaster and see what lurked above. Another creak, deliberate, measured, someone, or something, was moving in the rhythm of a predator stalking its prey. As we ascended the narrow staircase, the wood groaned beneath our steps. The air grew colder with each passing second. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness like fingers pulling back a curtain, revealing nothing but the decayed grandeur of a house long forgotten. The second floor felt different, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was saturated with the echoes of the past. The doors along the corridor stood ajar, like silent sentinels guarding their long-held secrets. And then, the inexplicable, a child's laughter, fleeting and chilling, a sound that had no place in this mausoleum of memories. Instinctively, I reached for a door handle, only to pull away as if burned. The metal was icy to the touch, yet it was the residual energy, a vibration of fear, that made me recoil. I peered into the room, and what I saw sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through me. Toys are arranged in a circle as if left mid-play by invisible children. And in the center, a jack-in-the-box, its handle slowly turning, playing a haunting melody that seemed to thicken the shadows. It was then, amidst the cold and the fear, that we heard it, a whisper, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the dead of night. It said one word: "Leave." But none of us moved. We were rooted to the spot by a terror that seemed to seep from the very walls. We should have heeded the warning, should have turned back. But there's something about fear that invites defiance, a need to confront the unknown. So we pressed on, drawn deeper into the house by the same morbid curiosity that makes onlookers of tragedies. The end of the hallway presented a final door, different from the rest. It was closed, with a palpable sense of finality. As I laid my hand on it, the silence was shattered by a cacophony of rings. Every phone in the house was alive, a chorus of electronic screams, but it was the silence from the other end of the line that we truly feared. With a collective resolve, we pushed the door open, bracing for the unknown. The ringing stopped abruptly, plunging us back into a silence that was now deafening. The room was barren, save for a single window that framed the moon, a voyeur to our trespassing. And there, on the sill, a phone off its hook, whispering secrets into the night. It was the source of our midnight torment, the heart of the mystery that had brought us here. As I stepped forward, a voice on the wind beckoned me closer, and I knew then that the story of the silent calls was far from over. It was a chapter in a tale that was being written with us in it, and the ending was yet to be penned. Trembling with a mixture of fear and cold, I reached for the phone. Its surface was dust-covered but ice-cold under my fingertips. The rational part of my mind was urging me to drop it, to leave this cursed place and never look back. But I couldn't. I was entangled in the web of its dark history now, pulled by strings I couldn't see. I'd put the receiver to my ear, and there was nothing, no dial tone, no static, just the same silence that had haunted our homes. It was as if the line was waiting, biding its time for something, or someone. I placed it back on the sill, my heart racing as though it could break free from my chest. The moonlight cast an otherworldly glow across the room, and it was then that we saw it, a thin layer of dust on the floor, disturbed, leading to the closet. The door was slightly ajar, and the air around it felt charged with a silent warning. With each step toward it, the air grew denser, harder to breathe. Shadows seemed to dance just beyond the reach of our lights, fluttering at the edges of our vision. I opened the closet, the hinges emitting a sound like a scream in the silence, revealing darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight. I could sense rather than see that the closet was deeper than it had any right to be in the architecture of the house. A cold draft emanated from within, smelling faintly of earth and decay. My hand trembled as I extended the light, revealing a set of descending stairs, hidden beneath our feet all this time. We descended, the air growing colder, more foul with each step down into the earth. The walls were earthen, supported by old timber, whispering of forgotten passages and secrets buried deep. The silence here was alive, a being unto itself, watching, waiting. The staircase ended abruptly in a cavernous space that shouldn't have existed. It was a room, untouched by time, with a single table in the center. On it, an array of old phone equipment, their wires snack ing across the floor like roots. It was a nerve center, the brain of the silent calls, and the sight of it sent shivers through me. That's when the cold touched us, a physical presence, wrapping around our necks like hands. Breath visible in the air, we turned as one to see her, the lady of the house, a spectral figure in the dimness. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth a silent scream, her hands reaching out to the phones as if to make a call. The room felt alive with her anguish, her story imprinted on the very walls. We had found the source of the silent calls, but it was more than we had bargained for. She was trapped here, bound to the house, to the phones, to her grief. Her voice was a whisper, a breeze that carried her sorrow, her tale. She had waited, night after night, for a call that never came, her hope turning to despair, her despair to madness. And when she could wait no longer, she had taken her place among the shadows, becoming a part of the house, another lost soul in its tragic tapestry. We should have left then, but we couldn't move, rooted to the spot by the gravity of her sadness, the depth of her longing. The phones began to ring again, each one a toll for the mischances, the lost moments, the silence that had consumed her life. And we knew that we could not leave her story untold, her voice unheard. We were to be the messengers, the ones to break the silence. With her spectral gaze fixed upon us, the air felt thick with her unspoken words. It was as if she implored us to listen, to understand the silent agony that had kept her tethered to this mortal realm. The phantom calls, the endless nights waiting by the phone, they had been her doing, a cry for acknowledgement, for release from her eternal vigil. Her presence enveloped us, a chill that sank into our bones, a sadness that whispered through the very fabric of our being. It became clear that her story was not just her own, but a tapestry of untold stories, of voices stifled by the inexorable march of time. Our breaths formed clouds in the cold air as we stood amidst the decrepit phone equipment. The ringing had ceased, replaced by a hush, a silent plea. There, in the heart of her sanctuary, we understood that our task was to give voice to her story, to allow her rest. I felt a pull to the dusty equipment, an urge to reconnect the severed lines, to mend what had been broken. My fingers brushed over the wires, and the room seemed to hold its breath. With every connection I remade, a spark of light flared in the darkness, a fleeting glimmer of the life once lived within these walls. As we worked, the silence began to lift, a pressure easing from the air. The shadows receded to the corners, less menacing now, more like mournful watchers of the scene unfolding before them. We were nearing the end of our task when a wind rose from the depths of the earth, a mournful howl that carried the echoes of 1,000 silent calls. The room trembled, and the spectral woman's figure became more defined, a soft light emanating from her form. Her eyes, once hollow, now shimmered with a watery light, reflecting a soul that had lingered too long in the shadow of oblivion. She seemed to be waiting for something, her gaze locked on the phone line that had been her last hope, her last connection to the world she could no longer touch. It was time to give her what she had been waiting for. My companion lifted the receiver of the central phone, and I watched, my heart pounding in my ears, as he dialed a number known only to him. The line clicked, and for a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, a faint ringtone, growing clearer, echoed through the space, a sound that hadn't been heard in this room for decades. And she answered. Her voice was like a melody, a symphony of relief and sorrow, a sound that filled the room and our souls. She spoke of her life, her loss, her longing for the call that had never come. She spoke to us through us, a narrative that unfolded in the air around us, a story of love, waiting, and the heartbreak of silence. As her tale reached its end, the spectral light around her grew brighter, purer. She thanked us, her voice fading into a peaceful whisper, and with a final, shuddering breath of the house itself, she was gone. The equipment fell silent, the lights dimming as if the energy that had sustained the calls had dissipated with her departure. We stood in the quiet, a sense of completion washing over us. We had been the conduit for her voice, and in telling her story, we had set her free. The house felt lighter, the darkness less oppressive. We ascended the stairs back to the world above, leaving the underground chamber and its secrets behind. We knew that the silent calls would cease now, the midnight chimes would be no more. Her story had been told, her voice had been heard, and the silence had been broken. The nights that followed were eerily silent. Gone were the unsettling calls that punctuated the darkness, replaced by a stillness that seemed almost reverent. The neighborhood, once gripped by an anxious vigil, slowly exhaled, its collective tension unwinding as the realization settled in that the haunting midnight chimes were no more. It could have ended there, a strange chapter in the history of a quiet neighborhood, but there was an undercurrent of change, a palpable shift in the air. People began to speak of the house less, but when they did, their words carried a different timbre, a respect for what had transpired, for the story that had woven itself into the fabric of their lives. Sleep came easier, the dread of a phone's shrill cry no longer looming over our dreams. Yet the silence bore its weight, a presence felt in the absence of the spectral calls. There was a sense of something unfinished, a final note left hanging in a symphony's closing bars. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the sidewalks, an inexplicable urge drew me back to the abandoned house. The building loomed, its visage less foreboding in the light of day, yet undeniably changed. The windows, once opaque with years of neglect, now allowed the sun's rays to filter through, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Inside, the stillness was profound, a stark contrast to the hive of activity it had been on that fateful night. The old phone equipment lay silent, an artifact of a bygone era, yet it seemed almost alive, resonant with the echoes of the story it had helped tell. As I moved through the rooms, the floorboards creaking underfoot, I was drawn to the attic. The narrow staircase spiraled upwards, the wood groaning in protest as I ascended into the heart of memories long past. The attic was a vault of silence, a repository of remnants from lives once lived. Dust-covered furniture stood like sentinels, while boxes of forgotten belongings were stacked haphazardly, a monument to the mundane and the cherished alike. It was there, amid the relics of days gone by, that I found it, a single, framed photograph lying face down on the floor. The glass was cracked, the frame chipped, but the image was preserved, a moment captured in time. It depicted a woman, her smile like a beacon, her eyes alight with a joy that transcended the confines of the photograph. I felt a connection to her, a thread that spanned the chasm between the living and the spectral. She had been more than just the source of the silent calls. She had been a person with hopes and dreams, with a life that had been as vibrant and as real as any of ours. The discovery of the photograph was a revelation, a tangible link to the story that had unfolded. It demanded to be shared, to be part of the narrative that had gripped us all. With careful hands, I lifted the photograph and descended the stairs, the image burning bright in my mind. The following day, I placed the photograph on the community board at the local coffee shop, a small plaque beside it telling the story of the silent calls and the woman who had waited for a voice that would never respond. It wasn't long before the photograph became a fixture of the community, a topic of conversation, and an emblem of the extraordinary events that had bound us all. People stopped to look, to read, and to remember. They spoke of her not with fear, but with an affectionate reverence, a recognition of the humanity that had been restored to the ghostly caller. The story had come full circle, from whispered rumors to a shared understanding. We had not only uncovered the truth behind the silent calls, but had also reclaimed a piece of history, a narrative that would live on in the collective memory of the neighborhood. In the days that followed the revelation of the photograph, the community found a new rhythm. The fear that had once spread like a shadow through the neighborhood was replaced with an air of camaraderie. People greeted each other with nods and small smiles, a silent acknowledgement of the shared experience that had brought them together. The story of the silent calls had become a binding narrative, a piece of local lore that connected each resident to the next. Yet, the tranquility was a fragile veneer, for beneath it, there was a pulse, a subtle undercurrent that hinted at something unresolved, something that lay in wait within the very walls of the neighborhood. It was in the way the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a suggestion of secrets not quite laid to rest. It was during this time of tentative peace that I began to notice the oddities, small, almost imperceptible changes that suggested the story was not yet finished. It started with the clocks. Throughout the neighborhood, timepieces began to act erratically, their steady ticks falling out of sync as if time itself was being stretched and compressed by unseen hands. I would wake in the dead of night to find my digital clock blinking midnight, a silent sentinel in the darkness, its luminescence a archaic contrast to the enveloping shadows. The other residents shared similar tales, their watches and clocks betraying them in small, yet disconcerting ways. As the aberrations grew more frequent, the unease returned, a whisper of dread that rustled through the neighborhood like a chill breeze. The house, the epicenter of our story, stood as a mute testament to the past, its presence an unspoken challenge to the semblance of normalcy we had all strived to achieve. Then came the children's whispers. It began as a rumor, a breathy exchange between parents at the local park. Their children, they said, had started speaking of a lady on the phone, her voice like a song in the silence, her words a litany of sorrow and longing. The details were sparse, but the implications were clear. The story, it seemed, had taken on a life of its own, transcending the bounds of reality and reaching into the realm of legend. The children spoke of the lady with a blend of fear and fascination, their stories painting her as a spectral guardian, watching over the neighborhood from the liminal space between the physical and the ethereal. I listened to their stories with a sense of trepidation, the familiar threads of the narrative woven into new, unsettling patterns. It was as if the story was evolving, shaped by the collective consciousness of the community, becoming a living, breathing entity. It was during this time of whispered speculation that the dreams began. At first, they were fleeting, mere fragments that dissipated upon waking. But as the nights passed, they grew in clarity and intensity, visions of the house and the woman within, her image as vivid in the dreamscape as it was in the faded photograph. The dreams were not mine alone. Others spoke of them with a mix of awe and trepidation. The woman's voice echoed through the corridors of sleep, her presence a comfort to some, a portent to others. She spoke of the past, of memories etched into the very fabric of the house, and of the ties that bound her to the world of the living. The phenomenon was inexplicable, a shared dream that defied logic and reason. Yet there was a whispered voice in the night, a shadow that danced at the edge of vision, a story that refused to end with the turning of the final page. The community was alive with speculation, with theories and explanations that ranged from the supernatural to the psychological. But beneath it all, there was a sense of anticipation, a collective holding of breath as we all waited for the story to unfold, for the final piece of the puzzle to click into place. And as I lay in bed, the night pressing close, I could not shake the feeling that we were all part of something larger, actors in a play written by an unseen hand, our lines whispered in the silence of midnight calls. The crescendo of our collective unease came on a night enshrouded in fog, a thick veil that seemed to rise from the very ground itself, swallowing the neighborhood in its opaque embrace. It was a physical manifestation of our anxieties, a blanket under which the mysteries of the past few weeks could hide. And under this shroud, the silent calls returned. This time, however, they bore the weight of inevitability, as if we had all been waiting for their resurgence, a sign that the story was reaching its climax. The phones rang at the stroke of midnight, their chimes synchronous across the neighborhood, a chilling harmony that shattered the silence. But unlike before, I answered. The line was not dead this time. There was a breath, a soft sighing that seemed to resonate with the very air around me. The silence was pregnant with meaning, carrying with it the weight of unspoken words, of a message that was felt rather than heard. I found myself drawn to the house, as if by an invisible thread. Others joined a procession of sleepwalkers moving through the mist, drawn to the source of our disquiet. The house loomed before us, its windows dark eyes that witnessed our approach. The door opened with a whisper, a silent invitation into the heart of the mystery. Inside, the silence was oppressive, a tangible force that enveloped us. We moved as one, guided by a shared instinct, down corridors veiled in shadows, toward the source of the calls. The room at the end of the hall was awash in moonlight, a stark cell that held within it the nucleus of our fear. And there, amidst the dust and decay, sat a single phone, its cord severed, lying like a fallen soldier on the battlefield of the past. The air stirred, a whisper of movement, and there she was, the woman from the photograph, the lady in the phone. She was as we had seen her in our dreams, ethereal and timeless, her form a wisp of smoke that curled and twisted in the moonlight. Her voice, when it came, was the merest breath, a zephyr that carried with it the sorrow of decades. She spoke of a tale of love lost, of a heart so filled with grief that it refused to pass on, clinging to the only connection it had left to the world it knew, the phone line. We listened, captivated by the soft lilt of her voice, as she wove her story into the fabric of our own. Her tale was a tapestry of emotion, a narrative that transcended the barrier between life and death, that bridged the chasm between the known and the unknowable. And as her story came to a close, the fog outside lifted, revealing the first blush of dawn. The woman's form dissipated, a sigh of release that seemed to echo through the house, a final farewell to a world that had moved on without her. We left the house in silence, each of us carrying a piece of the story within us. The silent calls ceased that night, but their legacy lived on in the hearts and minds of the community. As a storyteller, I convey this tale not as a caution, but as a chronicle of the extraordinary, a reminder that sometimes the most profound stories are those that resist an ending, that lives on in the whispered silences between words. And perhaps, in the telling, the story finds a new life, a new audience to wonder and wander through the labyrinth of its narrative. For in the end, all stories are threads in the greater tapestry of our shared human experience, each one a silent call into the void, waiting for an answer. If you liked the story, please give it a like and subscribe for more. Thank you for tuning in.